Well, hello there, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on this webinar looking at maximising the value of board evaluations. I'm going to kick off because it is 12 o'clock. We are waiting for a few more people to join us, but I'm sure they will click in as and when. So my name is Leslie Stevenson. I'm the publisher of Governance Newsletter and also of the Financial Times Board Director Programme, including their flagship Financial Times Non-Executive Directors Diploma. It's great to see so many of you coming here today and to prove, we all understand that board evaluations are really important, but there's not a lot of point if you don't do them right. So we're delighted to welcome members of the Board Effectiveness Guild who are going to run through the session. We're going to have it runs in two parts. The first part will have two speakers talking about getting the planning right and using the best methodologies. And then we'll stop for questions. And then in the second part, we'll have another two speakers who will talk about the right questions to ask during an evaluation and developing a good action plan, because there's no point in doing an evaluation and just sticking it in the cupboard to gather dust until the next year. If I could ask you to ask your questions, because the panelists are all only going to speak for about 5 minutes each, but we do want to have a really good discussion and we want to sort of hear from you. If I could ask you to put any questions in the chat, and when it comes to the panel sessions, I will feed them through to the panelists. Other than that, I think that's all I wanted to say. And just welcome. And so we'll move over to the first speaker, which is Ian. Ian, welcome.
Morning, thank you, Leslie, and welcome everybody. I say morning, it's afternoon. So if we could have my slide, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. I don't know why I can't. It was working a minute ago.
Oh, don't worry.
Oh, there you go.
So I wanted to talk briefly about planning and scoping the board review. So I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll briefly go through these points. Firstly is to think about, what type of review you want, how extensive you want it to be, and the time frame. And I think those are key considerations. We often get asked about doing a light touch review. I'm always been very tempted when I've been asked that question to say to a chair of a board, would you appoint a light touch non-executive director? You wouldn't. And so from our perspective, doing a light touch review really doesn't work. It's just as much work to do a full review. And if you're going to undertake this type of exercise, it's really important to do it extensively and do it properly. So I think, don't ask for a light touch review. Go for a proper review, or a box ticking review either. If you don't see the value in doing a board effectiveness review, and I've certainly had conversations with chairs of boards who say, I'm asking myself, why do we undertake this type of exercise? Then you don't have to do it. And I often think it's probably more practical and more honest just to say, we're not going to do a review. We don't actually see the value in that. I hope people don't think like that, but there's really no point just doing it if you're doing it for the sake of it. You really need to get something out of it. My colleagues will come on to many of the components, but I think in terms of essential components to any review, the most important is definitely the interviews. And as many of you will know from the board effectiveness guidance, questionnaire only reviews are unlikely to be effective enough for a proper external review. The interviews are really important because they're done on a confidential basis, and it's that stage really, if the questions are from the reviewer are good and well put and well placed, the person being interviewed can really give their views of the board and how it can be more effective. So that's definitely I think the most important part of the review. I think observations very important too. A few years ago it was quite difficult to do observations. I think that the tide has changed on that. It is obviously the best opportunity to see how people work together effectively or don't work together, really to appreciate the dynamics of the board as a team and the committees. It's in an ideal world do a review of the committees as well, but certainly do the main board. That's important. And then Other components, will include looking at the board papers and having a practical report at the end, and that really is important. Making sure that report is practical and that you can use. You don't want it like that big contract that you've spent ages negotiating and it goes in the drawer. You want something that will be useful for you with a defined action plan and timelines. I think you should look at a range of providers. I always think it's good to have a long list of around 6, and then probably interview about 3, and making sure that you get the right individual or organisation for you. I think it's such an important process, and clearly as a board you're letting somebody into a lot of confidential information. You really do need to make sure there's a fit between the individual reviewer and the board, and particularly the chair and the company secretary. So those are the stages I would say you need to consider in terms of planning your review. I will come on to scope now. One of the things I always now do is a full scoping document. It's a bit like coaching. I think when you look at the scope, you want to be clear from the very beginning of what the objectives are and the stages and how it will work. And that can take some time to put together, but it really is worth spending time on that. I mean, typically I work with the chair and the company secretary on that. Sometimes the senior independent director may lead on the review, but it's really important, I think, to get those stages clearly outlined from the beginning, so everybody is absolutely focused on what the objectives are and what's going to be achieved from an effective review. I think you need all people on board. Again, if people are uncooperative in the process, it's not going to work very effectively. Obvious point. I guess I've been lucky. Generally, I find people are very cooperative and really want to get the best out of the process, and that's clearly very important. And have clear timelines. I always think board effectiveness reviews work best over about a 3 to 4 month time period. Any shorter than that, and it's very difficult to get hold of people's diaries, and you get rushed, and there's a lot of pressure, and I don't think you get the best out of the process. Any longer than that, I think you start to lose momentum. So aim for that sort of period. So if you're looking to do a review where you're reporting for a December year end, you really should be starting the process off of looking at different providers sort of late July, August, and making sure you've got somebody on board by about September. I think it's useful to ensure regular reporting. So I now do a monthly update to the chair about how the process is going, any challenges I've got, any difficulties, and towards the end of that process, I'll come up with the sort of themes that are coming out from both the questionnaires and the interviews. I think finally, I would say really important to clarify who is leading on this. Obviously, the codes will say that the chair should lead, and I think that's right, and definitely board reviews work best if the chair or the senior independent director leads on the process, and not diminishing the role of the company secretary, which is very important, but they really shouldn't be led by the company secretary. They should be led by the chair and or the senior independent director. I think that's all I've got to say at this stage, but I'll take questions during our question sessions. Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks very much, Ian. So we're now going to move on to Chris, who is going to be looking at using the best methods. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and good afternoon, everybody. Good to join you on this webinar. Leslie, can we just have my slide, please? Whilst that's coming up, I'll talk about which approach to use, building on what Ian's just been talking about in terms of the objectives for a evaluation review. I think building on the objectives that have been set for an evaluation is a really important piece of the thinking around effectiveness reviews evaluations, because I think we are now seeing a kind of maturing in the approach that a lot of organisations are taking to board effectiveness reviews. I think over the years, companies and other organisations are beginning to think in terms of actually what do we want out of our review, where do we want to sort of focus our attention. I think perhaps when these types of reviews were first started, many years ago, there was a sort of sense that it was a one-size-fits-all. Now I think companies and organisations are looking to be a bit more bespoke, and so how you approach the review and how the methodologies that you use may be dictated by actually what you're trying to achieve out of it. And so I think the whole piece sort of stands together as a good thought process to go through at the outset, and then decide what methodology works best for you for what you want to achieve. So just taking each of the common types of board review methodology, starting with interviews, which Ian has already mentioned, is certainly the type of review methodology that really is emphasised in a lot of the guidance. Interviews are very good for exploring issues in detail, which I think is one of the reasons that they are particularly encouraged as a methodology. Obviously, they are interactive and therefore allow the questioner and the interviewee to dialogue around the issues rather than just have a sort of a more binary sort of response that you might get on something like a questionnaire. But they do take time, not just in terms of the interviews themselves, but also in actually making sure they're structured in a way that really does get the best out of the time that the interviewer and the interviewee have together. If you have an interview for an hour, you want to make sure that that hour is used to its best, and the way to achieve that is obviously to ensure that the questions are well thought through, and the time is sort of optimized for that interview. A second sort of interactive, if you like, area is around board observation, and this is often something that actually companies ask for as part of a review. And I think the observation process can go hand in glove with interviews, because it does allow the evaluator to sort of look at the board together, having, particularly if they've had the chance to interview all of the board members individually, and therefore you can begin to see how the dynamics work. There is a danger, I guess, that board members may behave differently with an observer in the meeting. I do tend to find that whilst that may be true at the sort of start of a meeting, board members do tend to relax into the meeting that is being observed, and usually quickly sort of forget the observers there, and it doesn't change anything over the course of the meeting. I think it also helps, just as a practical point, to have board observation after interviews, because actually it's given everyone the chance to meet the observer if the interviewer is the observer, and that kind of makes them feel a little bit more comfortable with that person being in the room. Turning to sort of more quantitative approaches, questionnaires are obviously the other alternative particularly to interviews, and questionnaires are obviously quick and relatively easy to complete. Again, the point remains, I think, that rubbish in, rubbish out. If you don't think through the questions and don't have very well structured questionnaires, you are in danger of getting a particularly poor set of responses. But questionnaires do facilitate quantitative analysis, but they don't allow you to sort of probe and explore nuance in the same way that interviews do. The other danger with questionnaires, I think, is that you get a lot of questionnaires where, if you're structuring it around, for example, sort of, do you strongly agree, not sure, disagree, or strongly disagree kind of tick box approach, it's that sort of sense that people go through it and just tick agree every time and don't really engage with the questions of the process. So I think this is one of the reasons why really thinking through the questionnaires and how you structure the questions is time well spent, and gets a better output if that's the route you want to go down. Questionnaires working with a sort of trend analysis is quite a good way of looking at what's happening over time, and certainly that is a useful way of allowing boards to compare themselves with themselves over time. But also questionnaires facilitate quantitative analysis with other boards and sort of what other boards may have said about themselves as part of other evaluations. So if you've got an evaluator who sort of specialises in that quantitative analysis, you know, what you do get is a sort of benchmarking of yourself against others. I think the danger with that is it doesn't necessarily focus on the issues of the board itself, or why those issues might be issues in the first place. And it can be a very scientific but perhaps not particularly helpful exercise in focusing on the board that's actually under review. And I think, just as a final point on this before we go to questions, it is important, I think, that when you have an externally facilitated review, as certainly listed companies tend to do for every third year, it is important that it contrasts with the internal review methodologies of previous years, which tend to be questionnaires, because otherwise there is a danger that you sort of undermine the external review by just perpetuating the same approach to previous reviews, and obviously perpetuate the weaknesses of that approach. So contrasting your approach to an external review when you've had a couple of years of internal is something that's worth thinking about when it comes to methodology. With that, I'll suggest we move to questions, Leslie, and obviously happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
That's lovely. Thanks a lot, Chris. Ian, do you want to join us again? We have got a number of questions that cropped up. First one is, Ian, you mentioned the board effectiveness guidelines, and we've asked for details of where people can find them. Am I right in saying they're on the Board Effectiveness Guild website?
I don't think we've got them there, but we've got they're the Financial Reporting Council's Board Effectiveness Guidance, which you can, if you go to the Financial Reporting Council, you can download the guidance there.
We'll also put a link to that. We'll send everyone an email after the event with the link to the recording, and we'll put the link to the Board Effectiveness Guidance there as well.
Thank you. So
the next question is, should C-suite executives participate in the review of the board's performance?
Shall I take that? I think the answer to that is yes. I think it's really important they do, particularly, you know, those C-suite members who are regular attendees at the board, because there you'll see the dynamic between how the board works and Exco works. I think yes, C-suite, yes, any other regular attendees, and in particular, I always want to interview the company secretary or the general counsel if they're a regular attendee as well. The company secretary obviously will be, but if there's a different general counsel, then I would normally expect to interview them.
Thank you. And if any of you want to interrupt at any time and also answer a question, just leap in and do so. Our next question is, would you use the same set of interview questions for each board member, or would you tailor an interview question to the individual board member?
If I can leap in there, Leslie, because I'm going to be addressing that in the next bit of the presentation. So if we hold hard on that, I'll talk about that. But essentially, yes, there will be some tailoring, but I'll say more about that in a minute.
Thank you, David. So the next question is, what is the regulatory requirement for board evaluations with regards to frequency, scope, action plans, etc.?
Well, I mean, under the, if I take this one, for listed companies and for certain other companies that have regulators that use the UK Corporate Governance Code, there's really a sort of three-stage process. So you have years 1 and 2. You would do an internal review, and year 3 an external review. I mean, it's important to say, of course, that it's a comply or explain regime. So there's actually no regulatory requirement under the code to undertake an external review. I doubt very much if any of the top FTSE 350 don't undertake an external review every 3 years. You should also remember, though, that if you're in a regulated sector, regulators tend to like boards to do a review from time to time. So particularly, for example, the two financial services regulators, the FCA and the PRA, will certainly encourage, if not expect, an external review. Likewise, people like Ofwat, or some of the utility regulators. So there's no absolutely regulatory requirement, but it's good practice. And again, if you're in a heavily regulated sector, you'd be foolish not to take the advice of your regulator to undertake a review.
David.
Yes, I agree with all that, Ian. I just also add that in the public sector, we're now seeing that the latest Cabinet Office guidance just mirrors that and says that public sector arm's length bodies and government-owned companies should also be doing 3 yearly external reviews. So it's, I think it's becoming adopted even in sectors where the reporting council doesn't apply.
Thank you very much. Now, the next question is about questionnaires again. So I'm going to ask you, David, if you're going to cover this or not. Someone's asked, how many questions would you typically have? Will you be looking at that in your session? So would you like to answer it now then?
Shall I answer it in terms of questionnaires, Leslie? I think it's always a bit of a tricky one, but I tend to take the view that if you go kind of much above 30 questions, then you're going to get questionnaire fatigue. And it does depend a little bit on whether you're kind of doing board and committees and got separate questionnaires for committees. I think this is where my point about being very smart in how you approach your review comes into play, because I think you can ask with sort of 30 questions, you can actually cover an awful lot of ground very easily. But you do need to make the questions, I think, ones that make people think, but are not difficult to comprehend or to answer. I think sometimes you get a question that will sort of say, well, do you think the board papers are long, difficult to comprehend, and have a number of different things, and you kind of question, well, which bit am I supposed to agree with in terms of that question? If you can make it very easy to kind of answer the question, but still provoke thought in the process, that's good. I think the other thing in questionnaires is to ensure you've got plenty of room for comments, so that you actually are encouraging people to actually say why they say what they do in response to a questionnaire, and obviously offer comment or suggestions or whatever. So but I think that's my view, is to not make questionnaires too long, but really make them work hard to achieve what you want, and really help the directors and others to complete them.
What about the categories within the questionnaire, Chris? Do you have any sort of main categories that you think should always be in there?
Yeah, my approach tends to be to focus on certain key areas. I think particularly if you're using, say, the UK Corporate Governance Code as the sort of framework for it. So I tend to sort of take each of the 5 sections of the code as a sort of subject heading. But I do also do a bit of research on the company beforehand to really make sure we're covering the issues that matter to that board. And if if they've got a period of strategic change, I always ask about the board and strategy, for example, because that actually is the sort of fount of everything that they're doing in many ways. So I tend to have a kind of an overarching structure that is about governance, but also ensure that it does cover the issues that are relevant to that board as well.
Thanks very much. And someone's asked about hybrid working environments. How can board evaluations be performed? Oh, sorry, David, did you want to add something?
Just very briefly, just to say I absolutely agree with that, Chris, and to build that onto the question about different questions for different roles. Typically, I find I will use a relatively long 30-question questionnaire or more with the COSEC, where there's quite a lot of compliance questions, absolutely structured around the FLC or the code. But with other board members may use really less than 10, kind of just asking the big issue questions which are relevant to that company. So yeah, different questions to different roles.
Thank you. So there's another question on hybrid working environments and how can board evaluations be performed effectively in a hybrid situation?
I mean, I think it's more challenging to do reviews of hybrid working environments. I'm going to give you an example on that. Certainly when I've done observations virtually, it can be really difficult, not least because if you use some virtual platforms and somebody puts a presentation up, you lose actually most of the people on the review, so in the board, and so you can't actually see how people are working together. So I think it's because you're looking at the dynamics, you're looking at how the people work together, you're looking at body language. If you can do particularly with the observations, if you can do those in a proper face-to-face meeting, I think it helps enormously. I think things like interviews are much easier to do virtually or in a hybrid way, but trying to observe a hybrid or a virtual meeting is much more challenging.
Thank you. Someone's asked, would filming the board work? They said possibly board members might be more natural and the film could be used for analysis and training later. What's your view on that?
How many boards would like to be filmed?
I think it's an interesting one. Logistically, it would be quite tricky, I think, to set up. I think you've obviously got issues, the same sort of issues you have with recording in terms of permissions and sort of making sure that everyone's comfortable with it. I think it's probably something that would be very useful as a way of kind of referring back, but I kind of feel it might be a little bit tricky to actually set up, because part of the issue with board observation is you're actually sort of doing a 360 degree, physically 360 degree kind of view. You're watching the body language of everyone, and unless you've got a very sophisticated approach to filming, I think you would sort of miss out that by just sort of relying on film if that's what you were doing.
Thank you. Someone asked, how do you decide which external stakeholders should participate and how many is best, if there is a best?
Shall I take that? I think it really depends sort of how much time and sort of time you've got for the process. So I think it is good to have external stakeholders, as Ian has already said, and to get that perspective that sort of contrasts almost with the board members themselves, so that you can kind of get a sense of how others perceive what the board is doing within the board meeting is really useful. And I think the key is probably deciding which are the key stakeholders for the board as opposed to the organisation who you might want to get opinions for. I think you probably don't want more than possibly, I don't know, 4 or 5 externals, maybe 6, just in terms of sort of quantity and the production of the timing of the exercise and obviously the production of the report. But I'm not sure there's a hard and fast answer on that. And David, I see you got your hand up, so I'll let you pick that one up.
Again, really agree with not a hard and fast answer. I think it's one of the absolutely critical parts of the scoping work, which Ian was mentioned, to have that conversation about which stakeholders. Again, wearing my public sector board hat, I would say for arm's length bodies or for public sector boards that have a sponsoring department, we would always interview the representative of that sponsor department as part of the review. Sometimes they sit on the board, in which case it's easy, but when they don't, they're a crucial stakeholder. They're kind of the shareholder stakeholder. So I would always include them on public boards.
And can I, when I've done public sector bodies, I have interviewed either a government representative or a sponsoring department. It may just be me. I've not had much success with auditors. When I've interviewed them, they've been quite, say cage is the wrong word, but they haven't been particularly open. So I've tended not to interview the external auditor. But that may just be my bad experience.
Okay, so we've got a few more questions, and then I want to move on. So the first one is, what is a typical structure stroke framework that will be used for a questionnaire?
I think that going back to what I said, it really depends what the objectives are. But if you're sort of taking a sort of straight down the line, code compliant questionnaire, I think I would start with the code, but make sure that you are very contextual in the way you approach the questionnaire, so that you are addressing the issues for the organisation, but within that framework of the code. And I think the other thing is not to be afraid to go off piste away from the code, to really make sure you do cover areas like strategy or culture or employees or anything that is of particular relevance to that organisation that isn't actually covered by the code. I mean, just for example, the code, the UK Corporate Governance Code, is not particularly strong on things like ethics and sort of anti-bribery and corruption, but actually that potentially is an important governance area for boards. So I would always quite often try and include that sort of question in a questionnaire.
Thank you. And what about board committee performance? Is that reviewed as part of the board's performance, or is it a separate review?
It can be either, I think, is the straight answer to that question. Sometimes if a board wants to keep the process fairly slim, what I'll do is focus on the board committees within the whole questionnaire for the board. What's quite good about that is it actually gets a sense of whether the non-board committee members are really getting a full picture of what that committee is doing. If you do a committee-only questionnaire, it tends to be very much marking their own homework, but it doesn't actually say how they're interacting with the rest of the board. So it depends what you want to do and how far you want to extend the brief of the process. But both options are possible, I would say.
Thank you.
Can I add to that, Leslie? I mean,
yeah,
sometimes you get boards with 6 or 7 committees. So I think if that's the case, you might have to make a choice which committees you're going to include within the review, certainly in terms of observations and doing interviews.
Thank you. And the last question in this session, there's a couple more that have come in, but I'm going to hold on to them for after the next presentations. Are there any sort of questionnaire examples that people can have a look at that you would refer people to?
No, because I think a lot of the ones, if you Google questionnaires, they're pretty useless, actually, in my view. I think, and it does go to my point more seriously, that actually, if you take an off-the-shelf questionnaire, you've got to bespoke it to what you're trying to do with the organisation. It goes back to what we said about objectives and outputs and areas of analysis. So I would say no. It's online, get something, but don't use that. Use it as a starting point for developing what you want to do.
Ian, you wanted to say something? Yeah,
I agree with Chris. The only thing I would say is you can get some idea of the areas that you might want to ask questions about in the things. The board effectiveness guidance has some areas that the review, I think it's paragraph 113 or some, but have a look at that.
Thank you very much.
And I'd just add to that that actually for charities, I think the Charity Commission guidance for smaller charities, they do one for larger, one for small. The one for smaller charities has some quite good questionnaire material in that, which is specifically tailored to the charity sector. But if you're in that sector, that's worth a look. I don't know, Ian, Chris, whether you agree.
Yeah, I think they're both of those are very good codes, both the large and smaller charities code.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So we're going to move on now. There will be more opportunity for questions at the end of the next 2 presentations. So I'm going to ask David to talk about asking the right questions in the right way, please.
Thank you very much for that, Leslie. And I'm very conscious doing a presentation on asking the right questions in the right way, that for the last half hour it's been PMQs, and some of you may have had a window open watching how the Prime Minister has been answering some tricky questions. But be interested to see the results of that. Anyway, what I want to dive into really is to pick up on what Chris and Ian were saying about the importance of getting the scope of the review right, tailoring the focus to the needs of the company, and matching the objectives to the approach that you use. That's all really about getting a review off on the right foot, making sure that you're getting things on the right track. I really want to dive now into the heart of a review, which is the questions that a reviewer asks board members and, as we said, other stakeholders in interviews. And for me, getting those questions right, asking them in the right way, is the most critical enabler of really getting value from a board review. I'd say right at the start that what I'm talking about here is interview questions with board members, non-executives, executives. Separately from that, certainly we at CSuite do an interview with the company secretary or board secretary, which is much more structured than this. So some of the things I'm talking about here about not checking compliance and all of that, actually there's a separate interview with the board secretary and a separate questionnaire, which is very much more about the details of the mechanics of the board. What I'm talking about in the next 5 minutes is really about the interview questions I would ask with other board members, executive and non-executive. So kind of key to kicking that off is some do's and don'ts. And actually I'll start with the don'ts, because sometimes some of the problems is to do with not the questions you ask, but the perceptions that board members may have of the questions you might ask. So I find it's really valuable before an interview itself to really help manage their expectations that an effective board member interview, it's not an audit process, it's not an interrogation, it's not trying to catch people out where they may not have been complying with specific rules in a governance code. I really rather try and think about it is it's a process of joint diagnosis, the reviewer and the board member working together to say, actually, can we understand how this board works now and how it could work more effectively in the future? So it's about far more than data gathering. It's an early and very active part of the whole improvement process that should come from an effective board review and the results of review. So good interview questions need to create the environment for that sort of improvement conversation to stimulate reflection from board members. So to kind of put them at their ease, take away the feels that it might be an interrogation, and try and get into a reflective conversation where people can explore that joint diagnosis of what good may look like. And for me, key to that is asking open questions, and open questions that explore the future of the organization, help explain how the strategy of the organization may need to be reflected in its governance. So understand what the future challenges the organization faces and what are the consequences of that for the board. Consequences in terms of capabilities. If the organization is moving into a new area, does that mean you need new capabilities around the board table? Focus of board meetings, where are the risks and opportunities in that future? Information requirements in that future, which may be different from the past. So very much about learning from the past, but you can't change the past. You might need to learn the lessons from it to apply them to a different future. Then in designing good questions for interviews, one of the things I think is really important is to separate things where you may go down rabbit holes to do with current business problems from the real focus of an effectiveness review, which is about the governance of the organization. And so questions which build on where the business is coming from, but really focus on what are the consequences of that for the board. I often start with some questions which are really about where the board has been at its best in the last 12 months, what characterized that performance, what enabled that performance, what enabled it to deal with some of the difficult issues in the past, but then go on to say about what the future might be and how that might be different. And the kind of common thread is that through that is to try and ask questions with open possibilities for creative discussions about what good may look like, what may improve the performance. And that's both in terms of the mechanics of the board, the papers that are produced, the information requirements, the structure of the agendas. And for me, good board meetings always start with good papers. So kind of how does that mechanic support the right discussions, but then build on that to say, actually, how do the dynamics of the board enable you to improve the performance of the organisation, building on that, the mechanics. And through all that, it's really trying to design a process that, through that cycle of interactions, which builds trust, which encourages honesty, increases the likelihood that any recommendations coming from the review will be supported and implemented, because you've already been discussing about what those might be through that interviewing process. And finally, at the end of my time, I don't want you to think that this process is always a cosy chat. And Leslie, if you click on it, we should have one more bullet point coming up on the slide. Often I find that some of the greatest insights from interviews can come in the moments where the temperature drops and there's a bit of tension in the room, and you can notice that and say, oh, what's that about? Are we touching on an area where perhaps the board is not as effective as it might be, and what insights does that lead? So we want to build trust, we want to build confidence, we want to have a creative process of joint diagnosis, but we also need to notice the points of tension, because that can give you great information as well. I think that's my 5 minutes. I'll stop there and then pick up any questions or questions later. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, David. So now Chris is back for the final session on developing a good action plan. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. So the final section, yes, is thinking about the action plan. So we've gone through the process, we've had our interviews. You'll have had, the board have had a report from the evaluator, and there will be a series of recommendations that are presented to the board and provided to the board. And sometimes that becomes the end of the process, as far as certainly my involvement might be, which can be a bit crazy really, because what you do with the time that you've spent on the whole process is actually the key to making it really work for the organisation. So just in terms of a few observations on, you know, the need and the execution of action plans, and then some tips for making them valuable. I think, just really building on the point I've just made, it is important that you don't see action plans as a sort of PS to the whole process, but actually almost certainly as important a part of the process as everything that goes before, and certainly something that needs to be given appropriate time, attention, and resource if necessary. And, you know, sort of contrasting or building on that point, I think if you have a review that doesn't really take the action plan forward, it is a wasted opportunity. It's a bit of a waste of time for the whole process, but it's certainly missing an opportunity to really build on what's gone before and make some really good improvements as they're needed. And with that in mind, I think it is important to treat action plans like any project plan, with some very kind of clear accountabilities and deadlines and so on, which I'll come on to in a minute, in the panel on the right hand side. But I think sort of the process should allow time to really understand the recommendations that have been made by the evaluator, and to really decide what it is that the action plan should be. And sometimes you get a board that will sort of listen to the recommendations, agree with everything that's been said, and it's almost as said, okay, well, we'll do that. And actually, a lot of recommendations will be pointing towards an action plan without necessarily deciding or dictating what that action plan or the specific action should be. And so you do need time in the process and in the board's discussions to ensure that recommendations are evaluated and turned into actions that the board agree with, that the board endorse, and turn into something that is clearly deliverable and accounted for. And so having that clarity about what the actions are and devoting board time to ensuring that that's allowed for is important, and maybe it's the role of the company secretary or the board secretary to be creating that plan and the custodian of it, or maybe it's someone else, but the key thing is to ensure that piece of work is done as you go forward from the sort of report that's been made. And I think just to pick up on a point that David's just made, the recommendations will have come out of interviews, questionnaires, whatever it is that the methodology that's been used. And they shouldn't in some ways be a complete surprise to the board members when they read them, because a lot of recommendations will have their foundation in things that the board members have said, and they should sort of recognise where the recommendations come from. Evaluators will add their own perspective to that and can provide an external resource to kind of give new ideas and new thoughts about where to take it. But it still remains the requirement that the board themselves build on that and actually turn it into a realistic plan. And the key about the plan is that it does need to be pretty smart. It needs to be very specific rather than very generic. You know, have more meetings is not particularly specific. So what do we mean by that? It does need to be measurable, achievable, realistic and timely, as any project plan should be. And I think it is important to ensure that there is that iteration of review and, if necessary, adaptation as you go through it, and that there are proper resources and owners assigned to it. A number of boards that I know of will sort of do a 6-month review after the action plan has been agreed to ensure that they have done what they've said they're going to do, or you make whatever changes they think is appropriate. And I think building on that and building on what you've done before in subsequent reviews, whether they're internal or external, is a valuable thing, because it gives continuity to the cycle of board reviews and committee reviews and so on, maybe over that 3-year period that the UK Corporate Governance Code anticipates, so that this isn't just we do the review this year, we do something and then we start all over again as if the previous review kind of didn't exist. I think it helps boards build up that sort of sense of continuum and progress by keeping plans under review and then building on them next time. I think as a sort of final point before we go to questions on this, is that it is helpful if you can build your action plans into other initiatives that the board has undertaken. Had a good example of this quite recently, where actually I undertook a board review, and the report actually happened to be considered by the board at the same time that they were having their annual sort of strategy day and subsequent board meeting. And what was interesting is that there was a kind of confluence of some of the things the board that were deciding they needed to do with the executive team through that strategy review, and some of the changes. In this case, it was around KPIs and content of board papers that were actually sort of directly correlating to some of the things that were coming out of the strategy day. So a kind of illustration of how you can build action plans into other areas of activity of the board, or they can be really enhanced by building them into other areas of the board. And also mention CPD, they could sort of feed into director development plans as well. I'll kind of pause there on this slide, and Leslie, I guess perhaps good to go back to the questions and the panel.
Yeah, before you do that, Ian had his hand raised. So did you want to make a comment, Ian?
Yeah, just a couple of comments on recommendations and action plans. I mean, firstly, when I do the interviews, I always ask what is somebody expecting from the board effectiveness review, and sometimes I'll say 3 or 4 clear recommendations. I've heard of board reviewers putting 40 or 50 recommendations down in a report, which leads me to believe perhaps the board should go home if it's like that. But I think what you do need is, maybe half a dozen recommendations. And whilst I don't prioritise them, because I think that's for the board to do, I might say, if it was down to me, which I believe are most important. And secondly, in terms of action plans and reports generally, if you're in a heavily regulated sector, financial services is the obvious one. Remember that the report and the action plan will be seen by the regulator.
Thank you. Okay, so moving back to, we've still got some questions outstanding. How about ESG considerations, stroke reporting undertaken by the board? Would you typically cover those, include those in the review?
Yes, is definitely the answer. I think ESG considerations are so important in the current environment from a listed company point of view. It's just the big thing for investors. It's obviously the big thing for the regulators. And I think in the last few years, really since sort of 2018, with the real emphasis on Section 172 and how directors fulfil their duties under the Companies Act, I'd argue it's remiss not to cover ESG, which is a significant part of Section 172, let alone anything else. I think it's remiss not to cover actually a good part of any review focusing on how the board is performing in that regard.
I absolutely agree, Chris. And I just say that again is why getting a good scoping document is important, so that the chair and the sponsors of the review understand that's the case. I've had one case where a board has said, well, we've actually got a separate ESG review coming up, in another 6 months' time. So just be clear about where that is happening.
Thank you. And someone's asked about, what about individual board members' performance as opposed to the board as a whole? Are they reviewed? And if so, how do you manage those reviews?
Shall I take this? I mean, if you look at the guidance on this, they suggest you should look at individual reviews of individual directors. I think there's quite a lot of care is needed here. I mean, you certainly would comment on the chair, the company secretary, perhaps the SID, and you would ask for in the interviews for comments on those individuals. I think what you don't want to get is, X thinks this is about Y. I think then it can become quite divisive. So, the real emphasis should be looking at the board as a whole, how it works with the executive team, and often you simply wouldn't get the time to do the individual director performance reviews. Plus the fact actually that's the role of the chair. So I think you need some care in this.
Chris, you've got something to say?
Yes, I think just to build on what Ian's just said, I think it goes back to where we started really in terms of what are the objectives of the whole review. And I think, one area that some boards sometimes require is to actually look at the individual contributions in a bit more detail. But I think that takes the review down into more of a sort of director's development focus rather than a collective board focus. And so if you're going to do that, then I think it actually requires a bit of a different approach and methodology, perhaps, I don't know, with psychometrics or something like that, rather than what I guess we're largely talking about today, which is the sort of collective board performance. Sometimes I know of chairs who will take the individual have individual one-to-ones on the back of a board review, so that becomes a different separate exercise, but it perhaps informed by the review. And certainly I usually have a chat with the senior independent director about the chair, because that's a review that they're doing, and sort of the chair's performance does impact on the whole board. So, that can be a little bit more proximate in terms of the connection. But I'm actually more interested in the different components on the board. How are the non-execs working to challenge and support the executives, and how are the executives actually interacting with the non-execs. I actually think that's a better area in this collective environment to review than focus on individuals.
Thank you.
I would agree and add to both of those. I think we must be careful as board reviewers not to cross boundaries. You know, as Ian said, the SID is responsible for appraising the chair's performance. The chair's responsible for appraising non-executive performance. And if you've got executive members of the board, they've probably got a well-defined HR process, which is part of their appraisal. So sometimes we do get asked to look at individuals, and I would always say it's a separate process. It may be informed by a board review, but for me, a board review is about reviewing the governance system as a system and how the components, the committees, executives, non-executives fit together.
Thank you. Someone's asked, is there a compliance register for compliance for board members?
Not quite sure what the question has in mind. I think that there are natural areas of sort of checking on compliance. Certainly in a listed company, you essentially have to go through every element of the UK Corporate Governance Code to be able to do your corporate governance report each year, because it's on a comply or explain basis. And I think, you know, increasingly there are other areas of company law or regulation which the compliance is, I think, picked up more through the reporting and some of the more general sort of company law obligations than through this process. I think a board evaluation process is more about the how than the what of what the board does, I think, and so I guess by definition may not be too much a sort of, well, David said, it's not an audit, it's a sort of review of how, I think.
Yep. Okay, so someone's asked about, for the action plans to be effectively managed, who's the best owner? Who would be monitoring the implementation and challenge as required?
I think I would answer the company secretary as the owner of the process. I think the danger is the company secretary, or the board secretary, is seen as the one who's responsible for it all. And actually, the real, it should be a bit of a joint effort, I think, between the chair, the company secretary or the board secretary, and probably CEO or CFO from the executive side.
I agree. It's a team job, and the company secretary shouldn't be landed with implementing it all. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes, so we've got three questions in the chat, but actually I think we can only answer one of them. What I might do is ask the team to have a look at the questions and see if we can work out a written answer, which we'll then send on to people. Maybe not with the immediate follow-up email, but after that, because they're actually quite interesting. The next one, in terms of when it came in, is how do you see the role of the evaluator evolving?
Shall I take that one? I think in line with the way that board effectiveness and corporate governance generally is going, and I think it's the right way, is very much more to the people and the dynamic side. So of course the guidance and the rules and the codes are important, but actually what is really key with any board effectiveness review, and key with an effective board, is how people work together or don't work together. I mean, I spend a lot of time in reviews being asked about having the right skills around the boardroom table. And I always say, you know, you can have 8 or 10 people who've got the right skills or most of the skills that you need, but if they don't get on with each other, if they don't work well together, you've got a dysfunctional board. So I think the way that the role of the board evaluator going is very much more towards the dynamics and the people side. So for example, I'm a coach and a mediator, and I use those skills quite a lot in the way that I undertake board reviews. They're very useful, for example, in both the interviews and the observations. So I think much more a move away from the sort of compliant regulatory code towards more, what makes an effective team. If a board is a team, and that's a session on its own, you know, but how do people work effectively together? So I think increasingly in the future, having those skills will be important for the role of the board evaluator.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Chris, Ian and David. That was excellent. Thank you, all of you, for your really interesting questions. I'm really sorry that we've run out of time, but we have. So just thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope to see you again on another one. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Leslie. Thanks.